You see some entrepreneurs that are like, they're not ready to, they don't want to change the framework that they're operating in. And so the only answer after an exit is, well, I got to go bigger. It's the only thing there is left to do. I must not have gone big enough. So if I got a $100 million exit, I got to go for $1 billion, because otherwise this didn't work. I don't feel better. I don't feel complete. I need to do the bigger thing, right?
I feel like that must be so scary, though, to say, I'm going to, in a weird way, becoming an entrepreneur and building a company, as scary as it is, because theoretically that company has never existed before.
It's easy to sort of, and I think I'm guilty of it too, just sort of like look at the ends of the spectrum and be like, well, very clearly somebody that's just starting out that doesn't know anything about organizational dynamics is very different from the person who is building or is scaling an organization. I think functionally for me, the distinction has a lot to do with that transition from what to who. I think that's a lot of it. Once you're playing at the who level and above, I think that tends to be more CEO work. So from a functional sort of like working definition for our conversation today, that's probably pretty reasonable.
So I am so excited to have Ryan Vaughn with me today. Ryan is not only a 3-time founder of Inside Out, an amazing coaching firm that helps a ton of startup founders figure out how they grow to the next level individually, personally, and career-wise with what they're doing. But also, I think I can call him a friend and someone who's actually been a kind of coach in some ways to me, as part of a small group that I was a part of, and really got to know Ryan through that and just understand his empathy for the founder journey, because you've been through it yourself, and what it means to learn, grow, and change as an individual and human as your career in life progresses. So Ryan, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate it.
So excited to be here. Thanks for having me on. And it's good to see you again. It's been a little bit.
It has been a little bit. The funny story that I'll tell people is the reason Ryan isn't working with me in sort of the small group we were with before is because Ryan rightfully charges a lot of money for his time, and it was too expensive for our group of cheap founders, which is probably to our own detriment, to be clear. But luckily, I still get to have these conversations with Ryan, and hopefully this will help other founders. And at some point when they're ready, go talk to Ryan themselves as well. So Ryan, what I'd like to do when I start things off is first maybe just talk through like where you started off with your career and how you became a 3-time founder, and even going back further. And hopefully this isn't offensive in any way, but when I was looking over your sort of educational profile, it's not a fancy educational background like a lot of people, and you see a lot of people in Silicon Valley who have this great background. They went to all these fancy schools, all that stuff, and that I would say many of them don't have the same level of calm, peacefulness, and frankly success that you've had in your career. But what was that like for you? How did they get started, and how did you end up on this entrepreneurial journey that you've been on?
Man, yeah, it was not a straight line with Ivy Leagues and all the other things that are sort of like geared towards the highway toward entrepreneurial success. That's for sure. I think about my life in I think 4 chapters, and it was really a process for the first 3 chapters of exploring different identities and kind of taking them as far as they could take me, as I sort of figured out, who I wanted to be and the life I wanted to live and the impact I wanted to make in the world. The first chapter, I think of it in maybe like 0 to 18 or so, is I was going to be an NBA player. And so really living into this ideal of what an NBA player would be. I played basketball all the time. I got pretty good. Also got tattoos all over because I was like, if I'm going to play in the league, that's what you do. And really, I had a model in my mind of an ideal, and I did my best to emulate that ideal in an effort to achieve that. And that went as far as it went. I ended up quitting the basketball team at 18 after I got in a fight with my coach, which was this sort of hot-headed, mistake to make as a kid. And I learned a ton from it, so I don't regret it now, but it certainly hurt a lot at the time.
What was the fight? Was it, I mean, not specifics, but like, was it because you disagreed with his coaching philosophy, or the direction you've taken the team, or the amount of playing time you had?
Yeah, I would say the leading indicator of it, or the edge of it, the part that really irked me, was the amount of playing time I had. And it was this strange, actually relevant to coaching, in that I found myself in a situation where I was The leading scorer on the team had a whole bunch of potential, I thought, relative to college ball. And after a few games was riding the end of the bench and never getting in the game. And it was clearly designed to send a message. And it took me like 5 or 6 years after playing before I finally got the message. I ended up getting it from a really sort of backward way of basketball learning. I was playing, believe it or not, NBA 2K. And
Yeah, great
when
game.
I was playing this, you ratchet up the difficulty level, you start playing against better and better people, and you can't just be LeBron and just like score on everybody and dominate. At some point, you get stepped, and you have to learn how to play as a 5-man team. And in order to beat that game, or in order to get really good at that game, I ended up learning how to play as a 5-man unit, and that's ultimately what, looking backwards, he was trying to teach me, is like, you play like your job is to just score, and that's not your job. And I wasn't ready to hear that at the time.
So this seems like both that lesson from your coach and your decision to kind of go all in on being a basketball star and getting attached in the whole thing seems actually a really good segue into the entrepreneurial probably mindset, because I can imagine there's a ton of entrepreneurs you work with who have had that mindset, right? They're like, I'm going to read every book about Elon, Bezos, all the kind of greats in the world, read all their books. I'm going to do all the things. I'm going to emulate them, right? There's even ones who I'm going to wear exactly what Steve Jobs wore every day, because I'm really and change the tone of my voice, right? To be exactly like Steve Jobs, and really, really emulate, and frankly, raise a shit ton of money in that process. Elizabeth Holmes was doing that. But so many founders do that. And so many founders come from the perspective where they probably were the rock star at school in the given place of work, wherever they worked before. They maybe were that rock star who could get it all done. And so they have the hubris to say, I can go start a company, which obviously, clearly, you and I both respect that hubris, because like, you have to be a little bit insane and believe in yourself in a weird way to think you can go build a company. But what is that? How do founders learn the hard lessons that it sounds like you learned early on in your life, which probably led to you being where you are?
Well, so I didn't learn that lesson after basketball. It took me another couple of revisions before I learned it. 5 years after that, I had a little bit of a chapter of drug and alcohol abuse, which taught me a lot as well. I was like, in response to basketball not working out, I went through this angry period, and I had to work through that. But when I got sober, then I did exactly what you're talking about, which is I sort of looked at the lay of the land, looked at what was valued in society. And at the time, this is 2006 ish. So early Facebook, early Twitter, that sort of thing. And if you look around, it's like, well, you know what is really like the top of the food chain in our capitalist society is the startup world. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go be a startup guy. I'm going to start a company and play that game, right? So in both of these cases, and I think to answer your question, what happens in a lot of cases for early entrepreneurs or for younger entrepreneurs, in the early phase of your career, you choose your life and your path and your values and all of these things. You choose them from a menu. Like, you come out of college and you say, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be a lawyer, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, whatever it is that you choose. And all of the other shit is already decided along with that. If you choose entrepreneur, there is an existing hierarchy in terms of what makes successful entrepreneurs. What they look like, what they sound like, how they operate, the kinds of books that they read, all that shit. It's all sort of part of the package. And I think that early on in your career, it's really normal to pick the thing, whatever direction it is you want to go, and run your ass off and try to do that as thoroughly, try to conform to that ideal of the successful entrepreneur, say, as thoroughly as you can. And I think that's responsible, certainly for an awful lot of value creation in startups. It's responsible for a lot of big startups, a lot of really successful entrepreneurs who are just playing the game, finding the right market, finding the exact sort of nuanced product that's going to fit into their building an organization, and just trying to build something massive, because that's what they think is valuable in this space. And then at some point, I think that can shift. Go ahead.
And what makes for, when you think through, I mean, two terms that I really want to define with you are, kind of like great entrepreneur or the best entrepreneur. What does that really look like, right? And there's probably a lot of different definitions, and maybe it depends on the person and individual. my guess is, if you talk to a venture capitalist, they'd say the best entrepreneur is one who's going to work nonstop, who's going to be smarter than everyone else, work nonstop, not give two two F's about anything, and essentially get this done to go build an amazing company. But is that actually, like, when you think through the most successful companies and the companies that, and also kind of how we define success itself, and that's another question, what is success? What is you've worked with so many different founders. What do those answers really look like? Like, what should be the definition of success? What does best actually look like to you, and how do you define those
Mm.
terms?
Well, so first off, I've worked with a lot of VCs too, and I don't think that at least many VCs would agree with the idea that an entrepreneur has to sacrifice everything else in their life in order to be successful. That's a popular sort of idea, I think, and certainly there are some that believe that. But yeah, my impression is that investors who have been around for a while understand the costs of that and the increased variability that comes when somebody is so keyed in one area of their life that it takes over the rest of it.
But
Um,
don't you as a VC maybe want that, not variability, but you're looking for a 0 to 1 outcome. Like, it's either going to fail or it's going to go massive. And if it burns the founder out, but you get your great outcome and that founder is broken for the rest of their life, like, so be it, right? As a VC, do you actually care, or should you even, right? Your fiduciary duty is to your LPs.
Yeah, I think that a lot of that depends on the scope of what you're looking at. If you're looking at this one particular deal, I think you're probably right. But I think most investors that have been around for a while, most investors that have been in the space and have built up fund after fund after fund, they're not around because they're only focused on binary outcomes for one deal. They're playing a really long game. And part of what allows you to play a really long game is a different vantage point that allows you to look at the big picture in this case.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that's just to dispel one notion. But your question around what does it mean to be the best entrepreneur? What does it mean to be successful? I think has a lot to do. My own personal definition of what's the best entrepreneur is the one who achieves their goals most successfully. So it's a pretty simple one, but that sort of begs the question of what goals are worthwhile to have.
Correct.
And
And going back, when tie that back to almost the
yeah,
point you were making about basketball, right? You thought basketball was the only goal worthwhile, and when it didn't happen, it broke you to some extent. Like,
yep.
that, lots of founders have that single-minded focus, and so to them, if you ask them in the moment, that is their goal is build the biggest, best company, which is measured by financial outcome. Is essentially how we metric things in this world we live in.
So I think that's true up to a point. I think that I've heard it talked about in terms of two stages of life, two mountains. Like there's the first mountain, second mountain, which I think shows up a lot for people that are multi-time entrepreneurs, particularly those that have experienced an exit and gone on to the next thing, or those that have experienced a failure and then gone on to the next thing. Once you sort of have, this first, in my experience, your first company, mine as well, my first three companies, in fact, were an effort toward building something big and meaningful and leaving a dent in the universe. And if that's your goal, then absolutely financial outcomes, how much money you raise, what's your revenue, what's your exit ultimately is how you measure that. So I think if that's the definition of success, then what is the best entrepreneur is going to be the one that achieves that the best. But what I see over and over again is entrepreneurs who have either achieved some tremendous level of success, they have exited their company or something like that, or they have achieved some level of failure and pain along the way that allows them or causes them really to, for the first time, take a look at the water that they're swimming in, take a look at this idea that, market success equals inherent human value that I think we sort of take for granted in America, certainly in the startup world, and reevaluate that. And so I've worked with many, many founders who, after their first exit, are like, fuck yeah, I did it. And so excited. This is supposed to be puppies and sunshine and like parades and horns and all the stuff. And ultimately, it feels like this big kind of letdown. Like, oh man, now that's that. And now what? And so I think at that stage, it's an opportunity. There are these, we talked about this one time in our groups. There are these moments between relatively few moments in life that we call liminal spaces. They're between the space when one thing ends and before the next thing starts. Exiting a company is an example of this, and you can think of some others. But in these cases, it's an opportunity to reevaluate not just how to achieve the goal that we've set for ourselves, but what goals are important, and sort of like reevaluate, what you want your life to be about. And in those cases, post exit or something like that, you see some entrepreneurs that are like, they're not ready to, they don't want to change the framework that they're operating in. And so the only answer after an exit is, well, I got to go bigger. It's the only thing there is left to do. I must not have gone big enough. So if I got a $100 million exit, I got to go for $1 billion, because otherwise this didn't work. I don't feel better. I don't feel complete. I need to do the bigger thing, right? And I think what happened for me, and what happens for a lot of people, is in that liminal space between all of the achieving that comes in the first half of life, or the first mountain, there's the opportunity to look not externally in terms of the menu of options that are available to you, doctor, lawyer, entrepreneur, but look internally, and to look at what, at the end of the day, what you want your life to be about, what's important to you. And rather than how do you play game X, Y, or Z successfully, how do you invent your own game? And I think that when a person does that, that changes the definition of success for them pretty dramatically. And it can be something that is entirely different from financial, return-based success.
I feel like that must be so scary, though, to say, I'm going to, in a weird way, becoming an entrepreneur and building a company, as scary as it is, because theoretically that company has never existed before. Yeah. I don't know, just when you mentioned that, I had a little bit of anxiety. Think, wait, I need to come up with my own game. I know how to play this game, even though building Levy and the work we're doing at Levy is brand new. It hasn't been seen in the world, and it is also scary to figure that out. I know how to play that game. I've been doing it for a long time. Yeah. The idea that I could come up with my own game and my own rules, and it can be anything, that is too many options, too much optionality.
Well, dude, and you don't have to. Nobody has to. I think
that's also scary. I want clear rules.
When I work with somebody that's I sense is in this sort of transition period, my advice is usually like, if you have a choice, just go bigger. If you have a choice, just like go do the things that you've always been doing, and try to, make it work at either a bigger scale or somehow slightly different that's going to work better, because it's just way simpler. The alternative is to really look internally at what you want your life to be about, not according to somebody else's game, but according to yours. And that's fucking hard. And so if you have an option to turn back and just play the game that has sort of been put out in front of you, then it's certainly easier. But I think about like when I was going through that journey myself, after I exited VNN, which was the last company that I was at before Inside Out Leadership. And I was in this liminal space. And for me, it was 18 months or so. And I remember talking to a mentor of mine and just really wrestling with like, I want to build something, but, I don't want to just swing for the moon and make this thing that's going to, like, my last company, I impacted 20 million odd people, and it didn't really feel like I impacted them that much. So I really wanted to feel something that was a little bit more intimate than that. But I couldn't figure out how to organize how to build an organization that was designed around anything besides build something big, right? And I was talking to this mentor, and he's built a software consultancy that's like $150 million software consultancy, big consultancy. And he's like, well, you know what, Ryan, we've never had a growth goal. And I was like, what? You can do that? Like, you can build a company without ever thinking about growth? He's like, yeah, it just doesn't come up. We don't think about it. Growth just happens. We focus on doing good work, and we measure the quality of the work that we do, and everything else is a byproduct of that. And so it's an example of just like the other games that's possible to play that I think us that are sort of grown up into the startup ecosystem don't even see as options, but they absolutely are.
Yeah, I mean, that even that that just your point there, because we talk about, we're obviously right now we're recording this December 1st. So thinking through, what is the year 2024 look like? Yeah. What are we going to focus on and build? And we talk internally at my company, what are our goals in growth? Growth is one of those metrics right now. And that's an interesting idea. Wait, I never even considered, maybe growth shouldn't be the goal, right? I do believe delight and fantastic customer product is a key goal to have as well, but it's a little bit harder to measure, whereas growth is a very simple metric that everyone understands. So that's an interesting thing to almost go on that tangent too. But I want to come back to it. I mean, also, you kind of mentioned VNN off cuff, but I mean, you were there for 10 years. You built that into, you raised $20-30 million in funding or something like that. A huge amount of funding, great VCs, built it into a 100+ person organization. You captured a huge percentage of your market. It was by many means pretty successful and
Mhm.
hit a lot of big heights. And I know just from our conversations, you necessarily wouldn't say that it wasn't fulfilling, obviously, which is why you're doing Inside Out and went in a different path after that. But walk us through that journey a little bit more and kind of where were you when you started VNN, and then 10 years later, which is a long time, but that's the average time
Yeah.
of a successful startup is about 10 years. Like
Yeah.
10 years later, who are you after that?
Man. Well, it certainly wasn't binary. I'm this person and then I'm this person. It's a gradual process along the way, right? But
Of course.
yeah, we raised, I think it was like 22 million bucks, and by the end of it, we were working with like 60% of the U.S. high school market. That was we were serving them with software, and biggest high school sports communication platform in the country. And when I initially set out to build that organization, I had much smaller dreams than we were able to even achieve. And so, I think that the version of myself that started that company would have been pretty fucking pumped at what we were able to do.
60% ownership of a market is insane, right? I mean, most
Yeah,
companies they put on their pitch deck, I'm going to get 1% of the market, and even that they might get laughed out of the room because that's so difficult to
yeah,
do. 60% of the market's unheard of.
yeah. Well, and in the high school space, that's like the problem to solve. I mean, it took us 10 years to do it, but it's a, $7-8 billion market that is all bottlenecked by distribution into all of these individual mom and pop high schools, right? And so that's what we went out to solve. And I think we did it. We, again, hard as hell, but we were able to accomplish some pretty cool stuff. And along the way, the way that I relate to it is I ran into the challenges of that model that we're talking about, this idea of like trying to fulfill an ideal, having an idea in your head of this is what a successful entrepreneur looks like, and I'm going to try to be that, right? How that played out for me as a CEO was I had a really clear idea of what a successful entrepreneur ought to look like according to society. Had an idea of what successful CEO would look like according to my investors. Another idea for what that looks like according to my employees. And my early journey of leadership was really just trying to be that person for all of those different stakeholders.
So basically,
And
so basically, you're putting on a different hat every
mhm,
time you were talking to a different group, and so you were like 5 different Ryans at any given moment, and then whatever
yeah.
was left over for your friends and family at home.
So the Venn diagram of those things was not quite a circle, but they definitely overlapped a lot, right? Because there's the successful ideal for a CEO, and it's not entirely different in all those cases. But I was definitely had an idea of who the audience was and how I wanted to present in each of those cases. But I think you hit on what eventually was problematic for me, which is that in all of this trying to be the ideal CEO according to all these different games that I could play or that I was playing, I lost track of myself. I lost track of what I wanted and what would leave me fulfilled. And that led to, a great deal of discontent around building the organization. I started to feel pretty shitty about myself just because I had a sense of how much work it took for me to be the person that was going to be successful in all these cases, and what it was like to kind of put on that mask. And what I think initially it was easy for me to, not even easy, it was really normal for me to expect that the mask was me. It was just like, I'm going to be this guy. And that's just what it is. And I
Did you
think
even notice at the moment in a moment, were you able to notice that you had different masks, or were you just
no,
like,
that's
this is Ryan
exactly.
at this point in
Yeah.
time?
That was the thing. And I think it took a certain amount of age and challenges and other stuff, that eventually I started to see the delta between who I was being in all these cases and then actually who I felt like I was and what I really wanted out of life. And when I got to that, the other thing that probably played a big role into that also is had kids, and that reorganizes a bunch of stuff, or at least it did for me. And I know you recently had kids too, so I know you understand that. So the delta between the person that I felt I had to be to run this company and was being to run this company versus the person that I loved and wanted to cherish and became pretty distant. And my first reaction to that was just, well, I don't care because I've made all these commitments and I have all these investors and I gotta just perform. And so this discontent that was brewing, I just shoved it down for a good, 2-3 years before I finally was forced to deal with it. And then that eventually ended up with me leaving the company. But it was
Was there a forcing
a process.
Yeah. Was there like a forcing function that got you to a point where you're like, I need to deal with this now? Like it's hit such a low point, or were you getting coaching before that? Did you even acknowledge you needed coaching? What were the things that drew you to recognize that in yourself? Because once again, like I know lots of founders, and I'm sure you do too, who never recognize that, right? They're massively unhappy, but they are unwilling to even acknowledge that they have a problem. And it sounds like
Yeah.
you acknowledged it. I don't know how bad it got for you to acknowledge it, but at some point you acknowledged that there was an issue and you needed to change direction.
Yeah. I was one of those founders that I think would have, covered my eyes as much as I had to just kind of ignore this as long as I could. And then eventually we were going to do this market roll up, and I approached my board and I was like, we're going to buy these companies. Da, 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 da. And they're like, great idea. We want to fund that. And we want to hire a CEO who's done the roll up before to do that. And that happens, but holy crap, when you get that news, it was a hell of a thing to hear. And when I first was wrestling with that, my reaction was similar to my reaction in all other cases, which is like, all right, well, got a job to do, so saddle up, let's get it done. So I went through the recruiting process while we're in the process of buying these companies, and we added a CEO who was really talented, fantastic, like finance, deal maker, and he ended up doing a really good job with that whole roll up, and it ended up really well. But the reconciliation or the reflection that I had to do, I still wasn't ready to do even at that time. It wasn't until 5-6 months later, after we had hired the guy, we had our first board meeting, and in the post-meeting executive session, I had to sign the paperwork to sign over the CEO seat. And when I signed over the CEO seat, that was when there was this moment of, I'm not allowed to be that guy anymore. If I'm not allowed to be that guy, holy shit, who am I?
Yeah. And how did you deal with that? I mean, it sounds like at least until that point, you dealt with it with just like, I'm going to get down to work and keep working. But I can imagine from an ego perspective, it is so difficult for someone you poured your life into this company and gotten it to this place. And you're like, why can't I also be the guy to take it to the next level?
Of course.
And
of course you think that. I think that anytime, there's a reason I think that it occurs when I start talking about reorganizing and being intentional about what a founder wants out of life. There's a reason that I say, don't do this unless you have no choice, because it's fucking hard. And the ego process, that like the ego death, there is a reason that they call it ego death, because there's a part of you as a human being, a part of me in this instance, that had to die. And the person that I thought I was, that I had worked so hard to become, this persona of success in all these different ways, couldn't exist anymore. And so in the vacuum of an identity where, I sort of, this funny thing that happens with entrepreneurs, which is like these questions around like, who am I and what am I here for and what am I led to be about and stuff like that. For an entrepreneur, they're self-evident. It's like, oh, I'm the CEO of this company and the founder of this company. What I'm here for is to make this company successful. Like, we've enmeshed our identities so thoroughly with our organization that existential questions like that are easy and kind of, self-explanatory. And then an event happens, you exit, or you have an instance like me or whatever it is. And all of these questions that normal people ask regularly, kind of incrementally over time, that you haven't dealt with for 10 years, just come rushing back all at once. And you get to, deal with all that, figure all that stuff out. And it's a immensely challenging process. I was fortunate in that I got to take like 18 months of just dedicated space to process that and to do that work. And then eventually, what came out of that, and I think this is, in my experience working with founders, this is at the appropriate time, the ultimate opportunity of entrepreneurship, is after you have played to whatever degree of success the game that was given to you, to go off and define the impact that you want to make, not because it's going to be recognized by society in some way, or not because it's going to, make X amount of revenue or anything like that, but because it's the gift that you have to give to people, because it is something unique to you that you can offer the world. And that sort of creation it's not functionary. It's not like, how do I find the problem in the market and then solve it. It's much more like, what is inside of me? What is here for me to create? And people do that are not entrepreneurs as well, and they could write a book, they could build something, whatever. But in an entrepreneur's case, I think the opportunity is to find that gift that is uniquely yours to give, and build an organization out of it, because that's the skill set that we have.
And do you, I mean, sort of a question that kept coming to mind when you were explaining this, and I know you can't take anything back and you wouldn't change who you are today, but I still feel like I have to ask the question, which is, was it all worth it? Right. And I say that from a few different ways. One, you did something that most people don't do, right? 90% of startups fail. From my definition, the way you're explaining it, like, your startup succeeded. You hit all the milestones. You did all the things. It went on and hopefully continued to do pretty well. Certainly, at least you got it to an amazing point. So it did all the
Well,
things
it
that
did.
most of us dream about. Like, if you hit it. So, like, was
Yeah,
it
and
was
it
it? But
did.
was
We
it still worth
exited, and
it?
it was great, and based on all those metrics, that was great. Was it worth it? Hell yeah. Yeah, no question. I mean, I think that I talk to folks that are in the process of their own, we'll call it like presence journey, or journey toward themselves, and trying to figure out what it is that's uniquely theirs. I did this too. There is sometimes a tendency to poo-poo the first half of life, because like the second half of life, it can be so much more impactful and so much more personally meaningful than trying to chase the latest gold star that everybody else is chasing. But I think the first half of life has a really important purpose, in that it shows us what we're capable of. It, we might think we're capable of who knows what when we're just starting out, but it's only through running into a market, running into the challenges of building whatever you're building, a career, an organization, a startup, whatever, that we start to realize just how much we're capable of. And it's how we get reality-based conception of our capacity to create, our capacity as individual and organizational creators. And without that, your second half of life is kind of neutered. You don't have a sense of, you might have a very deep sense of purpose and what you want to do, but you won't know how big and how impactful, and to what degree you can execute that, to what degree you can bring that into the world. So I think this, I think that the startup journey is one of the best spiritual growth journeys that is possible to go on, because all of this, this developmental journey, you're just accelerated on incredibly quickly. And then at some point at the end, you have unending, where it's like, company's over, either good, bad, however it is. And now you have figured out who you are. You've figured out what you're capable of. And now there's an opportunity to point that in a place, in a direction that is personally meaningful for you, that probably you couldn't see early on in your career.
Yeah, no, it's certainly one of the reasons I love being an entrepreneur, is because it pushes you in so many different ways and directions that I think you just don't. You have a different level of security, and sort of less of a need to force yourself to think through things if you work as just an employee at a company.
Yeah.
As an entrepreneur, you have so many more responsibilities, and it's scarier, but it also presumably pushes you on a further personal journey.
Mm.
So going back to that journey and like those hats that you had to wear, walk me through once again, like what you had at BNN, and then when you've talked with other founders and all the people you've coached, how do you change that hat or synthesize those hats into one unique, ideal, great sort of leader, in a sense,
Mm.
for the company, but also not just overall, but also at every different stage, right? I mean, VNN obviously had many different stages of a company over 10 years, and you had to change as an individual and leader throughout those stages. What does that look like? How does a founder go
Sure.
about making the appropriate changes and growing themselves to remain in the job, if that's what they want to do, right? Or
Yeah.
at some point they step out. But like, how do you recommend people go about that, or what do the best ones look like?
Well, I think there's the process looks, it's a personal process. It depends on where you're starting from and what your goals for success are. So similar, it depends on the frame that you're operating within. There are pretty typical sort of transitions that people go through. So one of the ones that we work with a lot is like the first stage of a company is just don't die. Your hair's on fire and you're trying to figure out all the stuff, and like that's one phase. And normally the way that people exit that phase is they're doing all the things, and then they figure out something, and then they backfill it, and they find somebody that's going to do that one function better than them. do the next thing, backfill it, do the next thing, backfill it. And pretty soon they've built an organization around themselves in sort of this hub and spoke model. And that, is how that early stage works. But then eventually that breaks. They become the bottleneck for all sorts of different things, and culture becomes an issue and all these very predictable things. And so there's one
Uh, uh,
transition, which is just from hub and spoke into like a developed organization. You're going to say something. Go ahead.
I actually want to hear sort of what that transition is, because this is very personal to me. So we're about 30 people at Levy today, and I feel like we're
Mhm.
kind of going through that stage. Like, and I, as a somewhat experienced entrepreneur, I've tried really hard to offload things to other people, but I actually
Mhm.
realized, actually, really just recently this week, because we did a lot of one-on-ones with the team, that I've probably done a really poor job actually handing a lot off and really, really trusting
Mm.
my sort of lieutenants and other people on the team as much as I should have. I mean, because I
Yeah.
know in theory that's really important, but I don't think I've done a good job of that despite knowing it. And so I'm in that transition myself. But what does that then look like? So you move from this hub and spoke to what a hierarchical org chart model, which you're still sort of the hub.
Mm.
It might look different. You're maybe not the center of it, but you kind of are still, because it's a top down hierarchy. So
Yeah.
I like, walk me through, what does that look like for
Yeah.
entrepreneurs?
So I think from like a papering perspective, or from like an artifact perspective, org charts or whatever, it can look all sorts of different ways. But I think the important thing to recognize at this stage is how context is created and shared. And so in the hub and spoke model, the CEO, or the person at the center, the hub, is context for all of these other sort of vertically organized roles. And so marketing needs to go through the CEO to understand how to work best with sales. Sales needs to go through the CEO to understand how to work best, to get the whole picture, the whole concrete, context, to figure out how to work with customer support or whatever. And so that can happen at a really minute level, like micromanaging level, or that can happen at a really sort of concrete strategic level. But either way, context is held by the CEO. And one of the big transitions that happens when a CEO navigates from that hub and spoke into a more developed model is they remove the context that they hold and they abstract it off into something else. Usually it's an artifact of some sort. And then
By artifact, I
the
mean like they write a document explaining,
yeah,
this is how we
template.
like to do marketing at my company. As like, this is the
Yep.
cultural milestone of what to do, and try to stay within these bounds.
Yep. And usually it's not I mean, it depends. When I've coached through it, and the companies that I've seen do it really well, usually it's not this is how we do marketing at my company. Usually it's more of a discussion around, with marketing and with me, how do we kind of collectively build something that leads to, more ownership and things like that for this eventual artifact. But the ultimate ending point is context is freely accessible for everybody. They don't need to go through you anymore in whatever that artifact ends up being. And I think if you co-create those artifacts, they end up, the body doesn't reject the organ. You end up getting a lot more buy-in from your team, and the whole process ends up going a little bit better. So there's structures that you can put in place and processes that you can follow to build, to take the context that is inside the founder and inside the CEO, and abstract that in a way that's useful to the organization. So operating systems and things like that can help with that.
Do founders still have a level? What's your level of control do you still recommend they have? And what I mean by that is, like, do you sort of say to the team, hey, look, marketing team or sales team or whomever, product team, go do, but they're sort of, type one decisions and type two decisions. And as long as it's a reversible decision, go for it. If these are things that we can't back up from, come double check with me as the founder. Is that the
Yeah.
right mindset? Or how much do you push things away? Like, what is the right thesis there?
I don't think there's a right. I think it matters a lot what the founder wants. And this is it's interesting to explore the question of, like, what's the right, how do we dial it in there, because it's that question itself is looking for, what's the right answer according to this, like, according to, like, how people do these things, right?
Totally.
And one of the challenges that I think is a worthwhile one to explore is, like, well, just because everybody else does things in one particular way, is that what I want? And so the first thing I would say is, like, let's be really, really intentional about, what result do you want from the growth of an organization, from the hub and spoke into, a more mature organization. And it could be that what you want is, you want to be really, really in-depthly involved with product, because either A, that's like your competitive advantage, and you need to be world class at that. And that's just like, it's something that you feel is important, you need to own. Could be that, or it could be that that's what you like to do and you want to spend your time there and that's it. And so your answer to like what altitude to work at is going to be really different depending on, product versus sales in that case, right? You're going to want to play a really high altitude in sales and a low altitude in product as an example.
Does does that change? Well, a few different questions. So one does that sort of altitude you play at change over time? Like I sort of have the thesis personally that the
Mhm.
founder should be going in depth on any area where it's the most critical to the company and
Mhm.
or it's maybe the most broken to some extent, right? Maybe it just needs an extra level of support. On the other hand, of course, as a founder who does that, sometimes you could also be messing things up by jumping in too deep and getting in the way of the
Yep.
team who's actually doing the work. So that's sort of question number one. And then I have sort of a follow-up question where I want to push you on some stuff too, but I'll let you answer that one first.
Okay, cool. So yes, I think that absolutely there's different levels of altitude that you want to play at. The model that we use and one that I found really useful is there's sort of a map of the 6 types of decisions in order of leverage. And so the most high leverage decision is why. Your why decisions. Why do we do this? Why do we do that? Right? Big picture stuff. Right below that, the second highest leverage decision is a where decision, which is like, where do we want to be? What does this look like? And how do we know we're successful in that case? So why, where are two really high level decisions. Below that is who, right? Who are the people that are going to be, executing da, 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 da. So those are kind of the high level decisions that oftentimes mature CEOs, that's where they play. Why, where, and who. Those are the three L's.
Yep.
Right below who, there's what. Now this is where there starts to be a lot of heartburn on the part of CEOs that are scaling, because what is what they're used to solving, right? And you gain leverage by changing all of the things, the problems that you're solving at a what level, like what should we build, da 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 da, and shifting that, instead of solving what, you solve who. It's like, who should make the decision of what. And that transition from I'm solving the what to I'm solving the who gains a shitload of leverage. That's one of the most impactful transitions that you can make in each individual departments. But there can be reasons like the ones that you described why you wouldn't want to do that, because you want to be involved in the what in this category because it's so important. And then below what is how, and then eventually when. So you can sort of map, and we help CEOs with this. You can sort of map your leadership growth based on what types of decisions you're making, all the way
Yep.
up that chart, and then we push them to kind of go a little bit higher when it makes sense.
And you actually have a really good blog post on this, although I don't think it's quite laid out this way. Maybe you should do a version two. But talking about basically moving from being a founder to a CEO, which was I
Mhm.
really loved reading it because it's actually something we talk about on our own website. As you hire Levy, is a decision you becomes a CEO. Founders should not be spending time doing back office tasks unless that is literally
Mhm.
the core competency of their company, which it's
Mhm.
presumably not in 99% of the cases. But many do because they are being penny wise and pound foolish. They're getting too deep in tasks that are not are critical to running the company, but also things that they don't get leverage in their special areas. And so, I mean, I love that you had that post, but kind of playing that out. I mean, essentially, you're saying like this is how founders move from being a founder to a real CEO. And maybe can you define that for people? Like what is a
Mm.
founder and who is a CEO?
Mm. That's a really interesting question. It's easy to sort of, and I think I'm guilty of it too, just sort of like look at the ends of the spectrum and be like, well, very clearly somebody that's just starting out that doesn't know anything about organizational dynamics is very different from the person who is building or is scaling an organization. I think functionally for me, the distinction has a lot to do with that transition from what to who. I think that's a lot of it. Once you're playing at the who level and above, I think that tends to be more CEO work. So from a functional sort of like working definition for our conversation today, that's probably pretty reasonable. And I think, you asked a little bit ago, how does a founder reinvent themselves, and what does that path look like, and what is that? And I think there are predictable patterns to that growth, like this one that we've been talking about. But what often happens is for founders is they can really well understand how to, like the everything I just described. They can be like, totally makes sense. And like, I totally get it. And they can absolutely understand it intellectually and try to execute it, and it can fail. And, well, why is that? Why on earth would you be able to do something and I can't do something, even though it's the exact same instructions and we both think we understand it? And I think that's where that's where a lot of an individual's growth path comes in, because when a person tries to execute something that's been successful for somebody else, but for them it isn't, the question becomes, what is it about them, about that individual person, the way that they show up in the world, the way that they lead, the way that they have relationships, all sorts of different things. What is it about that person that is incompatible with the results that they're trying to achieve? So when we end up working with founders, there is some amount of it, which is, here's the practical building blocks of how to build and scale an organization. But then you get into the messy people stuff, and you find that, like, well, actually, when I try to hold people accountable, like, nobody ever, like, our deadlines are slipping all over the place, and, like, I feel like accountability is really hard, and for whatever reason, this part isn't working for me. And that offers an opportunity for that particular person to do the kind of in-depth self-inquiry work to understand how they are creating an environment where accountability is treated in the way that it is. So for a person to reinvent themselves, partially it's understanding the big picture, how they're, like, the path that they're trying to go on, and partially it's a ongoing effort to understand themselves and how they're creating, an environment and a culture and a company that is problematic. So how they're creating the results that they say they don't. And that's the other half of that process.
In kind of, maybe this sort of answers the question to some extent, but go back to the point I wanted to ask and push you a little bit on, right? Which is, you were sort of saying, hey, look, you gave a very coachy answer in my mind, which is basically like, it's sort of up to you. You'll figure out what works well for you as an individual, and it's a journey to get there, which is what good coaches say, and it's true. At the same time, I want to push and say, hey, look, maybe there are some hard and fast rules to an extent, right? And what I mean by that is two examples. I mean, one, you kind of gave your outline of those 6 functions in the different questions you should be asking and where a founder should be playing. So, like, those are sort of hard and fast rules. So I'm sure, like, you need to move to the top level and asking that why question to be a CEO. So that seems like a bit of a rule to some extent. But then also other examples of that.
So
Yes, I'm a multi-time founder, but, like, I haven't figured out all the answers. And so when we have debates in my team of what to do, so, well, how do I compensate the team properly? I can come up with my own variant of this that I think is right, but I'm not an expert at it. I don't have all the information. And the right thing to do, arguably, is I want to go look at data that exists, studies that have been done by various business schools, and get that information, and maybe still make my own slight variation of it, but not, but use that data. So since I want to push you and be like, there is at least a best practice, maybe, and you maybe make that best practice your own. Is that the way to go? Versus just, like, figure it out, do what feels right. That was it, pushing you a bit, but, like,
no, I don't. I think that you're right. I think that there are best practices. Whether it's, like, salary ranges and stuff like that for individual things, or it's a framework like the one that I described. And it can be really useful to find those things and leverage them. I think where the distinction that I was trying to draw is between, this is a really useful sort of map of the types of decisions that you can make, that it orders them based on leverage. And it's easy to take that and then also say, so therefore I should always be at Y. And it's that latter part that I think is problematic. Best practice can be super useful and can help you to educate you on things that have worked in the past, on frameworks that can help you to sort of think through things. But they all come equipped with, or come informed by, somebody else's value structure, which may or may not match yours. And so it's worthwhile, when you're using those best practices, to also, as you said, maybe the putting my little spin on it at the end is, like, acknowledging that, these things, they're useful, but they're only useful as far as they go. At some point, it really depends on what it is that I want, and I need to adapt, the tools and technologies that exist to accomplish the goals that I have. So it sounds like we're saying similar things.
Okay, fair enough. One thing that I want to talk about too, also related from that article of yours about becoming a CEO, is where do the best entrepreneurs really spend their time? In that, not just probably at work, but that's part of it, but then also their free time. And I know you talked about, meditation and journaling and all these things. And I was, like, reading that, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, how do I have time for that? I literally wake up, I deal with my kids in the morning, take them to school, come back, I'm at my computer working all day long, night, deal with kids again, and I get back on my computer to deal with stuff after that. And if I can manage a workout somewhere in there, that is my day. Essentially 7 days a week. Like, and even within my day, I try to be pretty organized about who I spend time with, what I do that is high leverage, like having conversations with folks like you. But that's it. So like, what do you recommend is the best things that founders, quote unquote best? And I know it's different for everybody, but like, what are the right ways to organize one's time, since that is our most precious resource?
So I'll mention again that I have frameworks and all these things for this, and they do not remove the responsibility for the CEO to make their own call. These aren't right answers. They're just things that I've seen. They're patterns that I've seen across different CEOs. And you still got to make your own call on these things. But there's this really interesting learning that I had when I had kids, and I'm curious if you've had the same thing. Before I had kids, there was absolutely, positively, no question, no room for anything else in my life. Like, absolutely not. I don't have time for all these different things. So much work. I'm just like, I got, like, the company needs all this. And then I had kids, and the kids screaming, and I can't not deal with the kids screaming. I'm just going to. And that feels really problematic for a little bit. And then pretty soon, as you said, now I have a dedicated time where I'm dealing with the kid, and then in the morning, and then in the evening. And so somehow magically the work ends up adapting around these two big things that have become bigger priorities, right? There's this thing, Parkinson's law, which is the work expands to fill the available time and space. I think actually the work adapts to fill the available time and space. And having kids is a great example of that, because, when the output needs to be achieved in a smaller window, just means your work needs to change. Just means you need to accomplish it differently. You need to approach it differently. And then you can fit it into the window that is available for you by solving it more from a who level instead of a what level, as an example. So as life evolves, I think the idea that I don't have time for XYZ growth oriented thing is a really normal recurring thing that shows up for people, and mostly it's bullshit. Mostly if there's sufficient motivation, you find time, and then you figure out how everything else needs to change to make that work. All of that said, what I have seen probably as much as anything else around a lot of the high performing CEOs, there's actually a pattern that I've seen in terms of how they structure their day that might be worthwhile as like a starting point for people. They tend to organize their day into, loosely speaking, 3 chunks. This is their work day specifically. The first of those chunk is, and I say this chunk is of their work day, right, is self-care. And so this could be meditation, could be journaling, could be exercise, could be walking the dog, whatever it is, right? I'd say that meditation and journaling are the ones that I see most consistently from person to person. Exercise also. But, people have their different flavors on this. In any case, it's the thing that I see consistently is a intentional and dedicated effort toward sharpening the saw every day for people. And that tends to be, it's not a, if I have time, it's a priority. This is the first thing that happens in my day. The second category, or the second part of the
when
day.
you say
Yeah.
when you say sharpening the saw, do you mean physically, mentally, or both? And physically,
Both.
I kind of get, right, working out, doing all that stuff. I guess mentally, maybe mean journaling, or journaling, meditation, or maybe reading specific things that are sort of. So it's sort of both, sharpening the human saw, all parts of you. Okay.
Exactly. And doing that as a priority over other things, right? Starting from that perspective. The second thing that I see really typically is a chunk of time, say 2 to 3 hours or so, which is meeting free, dedicated exclusively to the most important thing that I'm working on that day. And all this takes some discipline for those people to do it. But normally what you find is, like, you get into the office at 9 or 10, and then for 2 to 3 hours after that, nobody talks to you, and you get your most important thing done. And that, of course, changes day to day, right? Your whatever the most important thing is, it's different. But there is a chunk of time that is dedicated toward working on the business, working on the high leverage things that will allow you to grow to whatever is next for you. And then, say, afternoon, noon on, or something like that, is everything else. And that's the firefighting, that's the meetings, that's the all the other, the incoming shit that comes at you as a CEO. And that lasts for the balance of the day. And so people have different variations on this, but it seems like a pretty clear pattern that I've seen from the founders that I've worked with, that those 3 categories show up, and it's usually in that order.
And is the contrast with founders who don't have that figured out, or maybe are not yet high performing, but obviously they're talking with you, so hopefully they're hoping they can become that, is the contrast that they are just all over the plate. They're not taking time for their own mental and physical health and
Mm.
well-being, and that they are just all over the place. They get to work, they sit down and like, whatever's in front of me right now, I'm going to focus on. I got a Slack message from someone, I'm going to go deal with that. I got an email, the first email at the top of my list, I'm going to go to that. Is that the contrast to the people who are not yet at that high performing level?
I'd say there's probably two. I think that's one of them is that it's less intentional, more reactive. Less proactive, more reactive. It tends to be how people start, just because there's such a volume of stuff that comes at you, and it requires actively saying no to things that are pretty important in order for you to carve out time to dedicate to the thing that's the most important, right? So you have to develop a skill of saying no and figuring out what to do with all those no's, delegating or completely saying no or whatever it is. So I'd say that's one. The other one that I see often is a devaluing of the saw sharpening. And that's, early on in your career, it feels like you don't need any of that shit. I just got to hustle. I just got to go and, work really hard. And if I can carve out an extra 5 minutes to fire off an email, that's way more valuable than 5 minutes that I could spend to do anything that's not, you know, directly contributing to whatever metric it is that I'm trying to move right now. And I think over time, people recognize, hopefully, sometimes it takes some time, but that it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And it's going to take, it's not just what you accomplish right now, it's who you become over a long period of time and what that person can accomplish over that whole period of time that is going to impact your success. But you don't see that early on. You need some amount of seasoning before that becomes relevant.
Yeah, no, and that's actually a good segue. I want to talk a little bit about coaching in general and when you find time for coaching or when you should find time for coaching.
Mm-hmm.
Before we get to that though, really briefly, I kind of want to just maybe open myself up for the audience as well and just sort of say like, look, I've been on that journey myself, right? So I've definitely, I feel healthier and more alert today than I was 10 years ago when I was first sort of starting my journey, partially because I would go to lots of events, I was meeting lots of people, but I'd be drinking as well, not being as healthy. I'd just get right on my computer first thing in the morning and start working. And I now have more energy and more focus than I did then, even though I'm 10 years older, because I don't drink during the week and not that much even during the weekend. I don't go out and party. Make sure I get really good sleep. I work out. I do all those things. And it's been really helpful for me. And I actually do organize my day that way. I don't know if I'm fully at that high functioning
Do you?
founder CEO. I hope I do. But yeah, pretty much. I mean, like I work out.
You're another data point, right? You're another data point of how this works.
Yep, and it's worked well. I will say the one difference with what you described, and I'd actually prefer to do it the way you said, but because we have a global team at Levy, I do all of my sort of firefighting in meetings between sort of 9 a.m. to about 1 p.m. Pacific, because that's the time that works with our entire global team. But every afternoon, I have from 2:30 through the rest of the day always blocked off for mostly focused work. It doesn't always work that way, but that's the goal. It's like it just blocked my calendar. You can't schedule it. My EAs know they can schedule stuff there if they need to. But generally speaking, I try to block that time off because that's usually when a large majority of the team is either asleep or nearing the end of their day. And so I can focus a little bit more and do individual things. But so
And then
that's worked well for me. So I agree with most.
The trick is in those focus times, I'm sure at least this is my trick has been, is don't, like when you enter into that focus time, the fail mode there is to do something reactive first. And if you do something like whether it's email or whatever it is, if you get into that first, that can start to quicksand really quickly. So for me, it's what I start with matters an awful lot. And starting with that thing that is long-term impactful, like sort of important but not urgent, tends to be the point that dictates how the rest of that section will go.
It's such actually a really good point. It's something that actually I need to work on that front, is because I usually will go into that reactive mode because there's a million unread messages that I'm like, I need to get to, and I want to try to get to people before they maybe end their day. They're waiting on an answer. I'm blocking someone and I feel obligated, but it's a really good point that maybe I should just focus on the big key tasks I need to get done, and the rest can wait. I mean, if something's actually blowing up, literally someone will call me. Everything else is secondary.
Well, but yeah, there's a really cool metaphor. You probably seen it where like there's a jar and there's big rocks and little rocks. And if you put the little rocks in first, the big rocks don't fit. If you put the big rocks in first, then the little rocks just kind of fill around the edges and everything fits just fine. So yeah, I think that's true.
It's a good metaphor for that. And so thinking through how you can decide what the big rocks are versus little rocks in what does that look like with coaching, right? So how does one find time? Because obviously to be coached well, I'm assuming you need to put the time and energy and effort in. It isn't just, I'm going to sit down for an hour, talk to Ryan. It's, I'm going to sit down for an hour and talk to Ryan and then spend a few hours after that working on myself before my next session with him. So it's a real
Mm.
commitment to improvement.
Mhm.
When, why, and
I think
how
that's
should founders think through that, like finding that time, and why
yeah, I
should it
think
matter?
that's
There's lots of
I
books
think that's
about
a little
coaching yourself.
sure. I think that's a little bit of at least the way that we approach coaching. That's a little bit of a misconception. So the structure from a time investment perspective, the new time that would be required is you're going to meet with your coach every other week for an hour, right? And that's going to be a new chunk of time that somehow or another is going to have to be accounted for. But the work between sessions, the in the world change work, the when it's done well, when that change work is done well, it's not a separate track that you got to go off and do separately. It's fully integrated within the things that are already important to you. So when you first start to work with a coach, one of the first questions is, what do you want? I've asked that question a bunch around this because it's an important one. If what you want is, I want to, build my company to the point where I can step away from operations. Awesome. Then your field work is predominantly going to be around that. It's going to be having tough conversations with your people. It's going to be building organizational artifacts that allow you to move from what decisions to who decisions. So, the additional commitment isn't I'm going to do some coach work. It is, I'm going to do the work that's required to get me the result that I said that I wanted. Right. And then that just comes into how I prioritize that work versus the other work that I'm doing. But it's all based on the track of the things that I want. Versus if you say, if what you want is something different, you're going to have entirely different work. So there's not a like a set 10-step path to becoming a great leader that you will invest in, go off into this dojo and do all the things, and then you'll come back and you'll be a good leader. No, it's fully integrated into your company because you can't be a great leader without building a great company. Those two things are inexorably linked. So all your work has to do with the intersection between the two.
What are then, how should a founder think through the coaching element of becoming a great entrepreneur? And what I mean by that more
Mm-hmm.
specifically is I at least tend to view things as sort of an ROI investment thesis,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'm going to invest X and I will receive Y from the output. So my thesis might be, if I got coaching, I will become a much better leader, happier team, higher output, and it will lead to the output and success, once again, quote unquote, success, however we define it, success that I expect. Is that the right
Mm-hmm.
mental model that founders should be thinking through about why to get coaching?
That's a good question. I think that for coaching the way that we approach it is when we first talk to a person, the most important question is, what do you want? And that thing that you want will have some amount of value to you. And if the value of that thing is relatively low, then the work that's required to go through a coaching engagement is going to be too much and it's not going to be worth it. Right. Not to mention the expense. If the thing is you know, worth the moon to you, getting out of operations or, closing a series B or whatever it is, if that thing is valuable enough, then the investment of both time and money into coaching, if you believe that that'll help you to achieve that it's many multiples, better ROI than you can invest in something else. So the first question is, I think, the most important one, which is, what is this coaching for?
Mm.
And it's not, I don't suggest that somebody like, I'm going to go get coaching because people like good entrepreneurs have coaches. That's a model that I wouldn't suggest. I think getting coaching is designed to help you make a change. And that change depends on where you're at and what you're interested in. And that change itself is where you'll find your ROI.
Yeah, it really well said. And then when you're thinking through that change that you want to make, I
Mm-hmm.
assume part of a successfully achieving that change is about finding the right coach for you, or
For
the
sure.
right coach for your circumstance. How do you as an entrepreneur identify that? Because it's not like you're necessarily good at identifying coaches. You shouldn't be. That you're not an entrepreneur who's a coach identifier, right? So it's not your score. How do you do that as a founder to find the right coach for your circumstance and situation?
Yeah. So a fun fact is, as Inside Out has continued to grow, and when we first met, Inside Out was me, and it was my sort of the name that I was using for my solo practice. And now we have 4 coaches, all of whom are exited founders, trained as executive coaches that work with founders from all over the world. And so I say that to say that I've actually had to develop a skill set in picking competent coaches. And so there is a way that I think about this that can serve as sort of a framework for folks as well. So starting with change, right? Starting with the change that you're looking to do. Typically, change is divided into two categories. There's technical change and then there's adaptive change. And each one has its own sort of skill set and core competencies that go along with it. A technical change, to give you an example to sort of drive that home, if I were to give you the instructions, go to the corner store, ride your bike to the corner store and give me some ice cream. Say for you, presumably, if I was giving you like, $20 or something, you would be successful at that. And pretty soon I would have ice cream, right?
Would hope so. Yep.
If I were to give those exact same instructions to my 4-year-old, wouldn't happen, right? He doesn't know how to ride a bike very well, certainly can't ride a bike while carrying ice cream, doesn't really understand money that well, and doesn't have any money. And so a whole bunch of different issues that the exact same instructions would lead to a very different result, right? So when you're trying to make a change, if the change for you and like riding a bike, if it's technical, which is to say, well understood problem, as long as I have motivation, I will be successful at doing this problem. That's one type of change. And the other one is well understood, but something is up with me that is incompatible with this result, and I need to do some sort of in-depth self-inquiry work in order to accomplish that. That's a different type of change. So what you'll find in a coach is a competency in often either the technical side, which is to say, here's how you build a company. You do this first, and then here's the next model, and you do that. There's a couple of examples of coaching organizations that focus entirely on the technical side of building organizations, right? And then there's the other side, which is adaptive change, which is I know what to do and I'm doing it, but it's not working. And that starts to get into the in-depth self-inquiry stuff. And that's an entirely different skill set to support somebody in doing that depth work. So when you're looking for a coach as a founder, and this is how I vet our coaches too, I'm looking for somebody who has skills, demonstrated skills in both the technical side and the adaptive side of change. Most often they get the technical side of change from having run a company before and having gone through that process. And the adaptive side of change is psychology and neurolinguistic programming and a bunch of other modalities that support with that.
And then should founders then sit down with
well, I'd say there's one more thing I want to suggest is there is a degree of presence that great coaches hold that most people don't hold. And lest that sound like, I'm aware, or I have a story running in my head that like, well, some people, maybe me 10 years ago, would be like, I don't care about presence. I just need to get my job done. But it actually has a very practical implication in terms of the results of any sort of engagement, in that when you're doing adaptive work, you're dealing with the way that you subconsciously react to things in your environment. And oftentimes you react to those things in highly patterned ways. I always do this whenever this thing happens, right? Whenever my wife says, take the garbage out, I get pissed. I don't know, whatever it is, right? But it's this mechanical sort of cause effect, like big Rube Goldberg machine of your mind. And that's a really complicated machine to work with. And so when you find a coach that is incredibly present, what they have done is they've done their own work on their own Rube Goldberg machine, so that when they're in session with you, you're dealing entirely with your patterns. You don't have to deal with theirs too, right? Because now if a coach hasn't done that work, they're going to have their own fear reactions when you say whatever you're saying. And now they're dealing with their shit and they're not paying attention and seeing you in the way that you need to be seen. So you can sort of sense, I take a great deal of pain to try to understand a coach's degree of presence. But when you talk to somebody, you can sort of get a sense of to what degree they are self-conscious, to what degree they're managing their own perception and things like that. And oftentimes just recognize that gets in the way of good coaching. So that's the three things that I tend to vet for.
And should founders then interview for that? Like should they get on calls with a few different coaches, get recommendations from their friends, and sit down and have a quick conversation to see if they get that presence and they understand that coach's style? Is that just a good interview like anything else?
I would look at it like a member of your exec team. Yeah. So how seriously would you take an interview to add a chief marketing officer or something like that? Take it pretty seriously, right? You go through interviews, you do everything that you need to do to make sure that you make the right decision. At the end of the day, this decision is to some degree based on capacity for somebody to support you in the work that you're interested in doing. but is also just like an executive team member, and maybe even more than an executive team member, based on fit, based on, you feeling comfortable in going to uncomfortable places with this person, and having a sense that they got your back, and that you guys will, you'll want to do that work with them. So you don't, you don't look at a piece of paper and learn that stuff. You learn that by having conversations with people, and getting a sense of like, A, can this person functionally support me in the adaptive or the technical changes that I want to make? B, is this person somebody that I want to do like really in-depth, uncomfortable work with? And if
So,
yes, you got yourself a winner.
and so on that note, I mean, I'm going to skip it. I want to ask, we usually ask one other question, then I do this. I'm going to do this out of order because it just flows too
Okay,
perfectly. If
let's do
people
it.
want to have Ryan as their coach, how do they find you? How do they get in touch if they think you might have the right presence for them and right mindset for helping them become
Yeah.
that great entrepreneur?
Yeah. So we are at leadinsideout.io. I'm sure it'll be in the show notes or something like that, where we can sort of
For sure.
distribute it. And there's ways of staying in touch over the long term. We publish a bi-weekly newsletter about CEO shit, which is the type of stuff that you can't talk about with your family and friends because they don't get it, and you can't talk about with your employees and your investors because they're conflicted, and you have to produce a result. It's that nexus right in the middle. That's what that newsletter is about. And yeah, we have, as I said, there are 4 coaches, all of whom are exited entrepreneurs and professionally trained executive coaches that work with founders from all over the world. All different stages, tends to be from late seed stage all the way up to exit. And yeah, we work with folks in all different sectors.
And as someone who has worked with Ryan before, I can highly recommend him in a big way. And so, Ryan, to
I
finish
appreciate
us
that.
off and end things, of course, it's true. To finish things off, what is the one piece of advice? If you could boil it all down, I know that's not easy, but all down into one piece of advice that you would give every entrepreneur. This is a thing to become successful and be an excellent entrepreneur. What would that be?
So I've worked with founders of some of the fastest growing companies in tech. I've built a hyper growth company. I've worked with venture capitalists from some of the largest firms. I've worked with lifestyle businesses that are interested in making an impact, everything in between. And the one thing that all of the founders and CEOs of these organizations have in common is that nobody knows what they're doing. They're all making it up. And so I think that the people who do that really well, the people who accelerate and achieve whatever goals that they set out for themselves, are the ones who recognize that not knowing what I'm doing is a fantastic place to start. And let's jump into it and suck at this for a little bit and get going. Versus if not knowing what I'm doing is a stumbling block, then that can be problematic. So I think just understanding that the path to becoming a great entrepreneur is to be a bad entrepreneur for a little while and learn. That's what it takes.
And hopefully continuous learning as part of that journey, and hopefully even part of the fun is how I like to look at it. Ryan, thank you so much for your time. Your time is precious. I appreciate it. I hope people find value in this.
So
I know
glad.
I've always, every time I talk with you, I find value. So thank you so much. And hopefully everyone finds you and gets in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Good to be here.